And the outline I've given you goes geographically, really for simplicity's sake, I guess. And you can sort through some of it as you need to. The things I want to lay particular emphasis on are the three I've noted on the board. Schopenhauer, and you have a chapter in Stumpf about Schopenhauer. There didn't used to be, but in this edition of Stumpf there is. And there are some selections in Gardner from Schopenhauer. Then personal idealism, because it's had a significant influence in American philosophy. If you look at the bottom of the page, personal idealism in America. And then the Neo-Kantian movement. So those plus F.H. Bradley in Britain. And him as an example of a early 20th century neo-Hegelian. Actually, the neo-Hegelian who profoundly influenced Whitehead. So we'll talk about him probably on Friday to make the transition. Keep in mind what I said way at the beginning of our discussion of post-Kantian thought, namely that that what you have in this idealist movement is the attempt to project onto the whole of reality what one sees in the lens, the mirror, however you want to use the metaphor, of one's own human spirit, human consciousness, conscious spirit. You see it by now in Hegel, that the self-consciousness is a microcosm of the absolute spirit in its unfolding manifestation in history. And something of the same carries all the way through. In Schopenhauer, as I've noted there on the board, he's a voluntaristic idealist, meaning that the aspect of the self that he finds most revealing, that is to say, most at the very heart of reality, is will rather than reason. So where Hegel said that the rational is the real and the real is rational, that is to say, you understand reality in terms of your own conscious dialectic, what Schopenhauer is saying is that, if you like, will is reality and reality is will. And so you understand reality in the image of the human will. So you get those variations coming through all the way. If you look down at the three bibliographical items at the bottom of the list, Ewing will give you a good overview of the idealist tradition historically up into the 20th century, selections and commentary. If you're interested in its influence on religious thought, then C.C.J. Webb's book is very helpful from 1850 onwards into the 20th century. And if you're interested in its influence on social and political thought, then A.J.M. Milne, quite unrelated to the Milne of Winnie the Pooh. One of you frowned. Have you heard of Winnie the Pooh? I mean, that's better in some ways than Dr. Seuss, if you remember Dr. Seuss. But those books are worth your attention, and those of you in political science or in history would do well to take a look at the Milne book. It casts a lot of light on things. All right, now let me start by commenting about some of the lesser people down the road and then come back to Schopenhauer. In France, you have a man like Maine de Biran, and in his case, it seems to be more feeling than will or thought. It's as if he's saying, I feel, therefore I exist. And feeling is real, and the real is feeling. You see, that sort of romanticized view. Maurice Blondel is an interesting character. He was a Christian philosopher, very much influenced by the Romanticist Schelling, but quite a philosophical and social activist in his day. There developed in France in the 1930s a debate over the question as to whether there could be such a thing as Christian philosophy. And Blondel was one of the active participants in that debate, arguing, yes, indeed, there can be, namely his kind of romanticized idealism he saw as Christian philosophy. In Italy, I've mentioned before Giovanni Gentile, who was Mussolini's Minister of Education, as a political thinker, the political theorist of fascism. Benedetto Croce, particularly significant in aesthetics, aesthetic theory. He's still read nowadays for his contributions in that area. So if you want a Hegelian view of the aesthetic, then Croce is likely to be a little more readable than the old man himself. In Britain, F.H. Bradley, as I mentioned, is of major significance. But A.E. Taylor is an interesting writer, very readable. He was at Cambridge. He wrote a metaphysics textbook called Elements of Metaphysics, which is a very fine representation of how a Hegelian idealist might do metaphysics in that conservative, old-school Hegelian tradition. He was also a Plato scholar. Somebody commented that in his book on Plato, he turns dear old Plato into a good Episcopalian. He was a theist. And he has another book called The Faith of a Moralist, in which he develops something of a moral argument for the existence of God. So Taylor's significant. William Temple was a philosopher at Oxford, but later in his career was in the hierarchy of the Anglican Church and became Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1940s. Did quite a lot of writing in social ethics, but his most significant philosophical work is Nature, Man, and God. You can tell from that he covered quite a swath of material. Nature, man, and God. When you've talked of those, what's left? Well, that's his point. It was a book on metaphysics, you think. But he also has another work called Treck's Creative Mind, in which he picks up on the Platonic notions of goodness, truth, and beauty, and argues that they are found in the one, God, the Absolute. I should perhaps remark, and we'll come back to this another time, that Bradley does not equate the Absolute with God. God is the highest manifestation of the Absolute, but is not the Absolute. Subtle distinction in there. He's trying to avoid pantheism in saying that. In America, you get an earlier kind of idealism in Jonathan Edwards, and of course in transcendentalism. American transcendentalism, Emerson particularly, is a kind of American romanticism, very much in that sense. But the Hegelian movement in England, which focused in St. Louis but spread very broadly, best represented, I think, by Josiah Royce, who taught at Harvard in the golden age of the Harvard philosophy department. Some people think they're having another golden age now. But back then they had Josiah Royce and William James and George Santayana, quite a stellar collection of people. And Royce sort of translates the Hegelian vision of reality into the American scene, talking of the spirit of the community rather than the absolute spirit, and so forth. But you can see some of Hegel's political thought and conception of the state coming through in Royce's view of the community, that American concept. And then you get personal idealism in America, represented by Borden Parker, that should be BP, Borden Parker Bown. Incidentally, University of Southern California for a number of years was a center of personal idealism, and their philosophy building is known as the Borden Parker Bown Hall of Philosophy, after this guy. The two major centers for personal idealism were at USC and at Boston University. And it was at Boston University that Edgar Sheffield Brightman taught for many years. And he had among his students a number of evangelicals, so that he had quite a significant influence in the shaping of evangelical thought for the 1950s and thereabouts. Did doctoral work with Brightman, so did Edward Carnell, the theologian, philosopher of religion at Fuller in the 1940s, 50s. And for a while it was one of the more influential philosophies among Christian thinkers, both conservative and liberal. At this juncture, I think it's fair to say that personal idealism is more a matter of history than a vigorous present reality. But you still find people referring to it with sort of nostalgia for those good old days. Let me say that personal idealism came in various forms, but in the Bown-Brightman-Bertocci form, it was not a monistic idealism as the Hegelian movement was, but a pluralistic idealism. So in that sense, it seems to go back perhaps more to Brightman with his many minds, you see, rather than to Hegel. The best metaphysical representation of it that I'm acquainted with is Brightman's book,